I'm good to go.
Good to go. All righty. Well, everybody, thank you for coming out today and a special event for the Idaho Museum of Mining and Geology. I'm Steve Cox, board president. And before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to remind you that the museum will be open after the lecture to enjoy our exhibits and, of course, visit our gift shop where you can shop until you drop. So today we have a special talk by Dr. Dan Luna, assistant professor from Boise State University in Geosciences. Dan got his undergraduate degrees from Duke University and his doctorate in paleontology from UC Santa Barbara. He joined the BSU faculty in 2019, and in 2022 he was recognized as the Science Teacher of the Year by Idaho's General Education Committee. Dan's doctoral research focused on fossil mammals of the Andes Mountains of Chile, and fittingly, his topic today is the evolution of early mammals. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Dan.
Thanks, everyone. Wanted to kind of just start off by putting us in the right time and kind of seeing what we'll be focusing on today in terms of the larger geological time scale. And I always want to do this, especially because it's important to emphasize we're going to cover about 150, 200 million years of evolution, and which is this time here that we'll be kind of focusing on today. How do we get to the earliest mammals is what we'll be talking about. But it's important to emphasize that what I'm showing here is a zoom in of this, right? And this is Earth's history right here. From 4.5 billion years ago to the present, most of everything that you think of fossil-wise comes from this sliver called the Phanerozoic. This is when animals evolved and became dominant. I'll kind of provide a little bit of a background. So this section is this right here, this little blurb, right? Those 200 million years that we'll be covering today is a very, very, very small story for a very specific group out of many groups. But it's a story that explains how our mammal ancestors evolved and what fossils show us about that. And so that's what we'll be focusing on today. And I want you to kind of keep in mind this one question. I think if you know anything, if you know one thing about mammal evolution, you've maybe heard that mammals evolved from reptiles. And I would say that's a little bit of a misunderstanding. And so I want you to kind of keep this question in mind as we proceed. Did mammals evolve from reptiles? And to answer this question, it's really important to emphasize how we name things and what names mean in paleontology and how they reflect evolutionary realities. And that's what we're going to start off with. For those of you who came to the talk last year on birds evolving from dinosaurs, this is going to be a very similar introduction, but many of new faces here, so I want to make sure people kind of understand what it means for things to be something. What does it mean to be, that you are a mammal, right? That you are an animal, that you are a vertebrate, for example. And you know, this goes back to 150 years before Darwin, when a couple scientists, before the word science existed, they were called natural philosophers or natural theologians. When a couple early scientists, including the most famous of which, Linnaeus, kind of started realizing in a very systematic way that all of life can be organized into groups within groups, boxes within boxes, what we call a nested hierarchy. And I like to think about it as nested Russian dolls that fit into each other, right? So, for example, I'm showing a picture here, right? You've got the bear. The black bear, Ursus americanus, right, is one species. It is within the genus Ursus, and within the genus Ursus, there's other species of bear, the polar bear, the grizzly bear, etc., right? And within that, all those species of bears fit within a larger group called Ursidae, right? And the Ursidae also includes things like red pandas and pandas, right? Things that are very similar to bears, but not quite bears. Right? Of course, all of these things have a bunch of things in common with cats and dogs. They have very similar teeth to cut meat, right? And we put them all together in a group called carnivorans, right? And carnivorans are a type of mammal. Mammals are a type of animal that has a vertebral column, right? So there's many things that have a vertebral column that are not mammals. For example, right, like a turtle or a fish or a frog, right? But as we kind of see, each of these things, an Ursus americanus, the black bear, is within the genus Ursus. Ursus americanus is within the genus Ursidae. Ursus americanus is a carnivoran, right? Ursus americanus is a mammal. Right? This is something that most of us have some familiarity with. Maybe we learned this for a couple days in school at some point, right? But the important thing here is understanding that all of life fits into these boxes within boxes. So all of animals can be subdivided and focused on, well, here's a bunch of different animals, but there's one group, vertebrates, right? Let's look at that group. And let's look at a subset of vertebrates. And let's look at a subset of mammals. And let's look at a subset of the carnivorans, right? And we can keep zooming in on life that way and see that it's groups within groups within groups. And back in Linnaeus' time, no one had any idea what this meant other than, like, God seems to be very organizational, right? And it was Darwin who, well, actually, before getting to that, just showing another picture along these lines, right? One that kind of shows more than just one thing, so from a kind of different perspective. Here I've taken all of animals, and I'm just showing 3 major groups of animals. There's a dozen or so major groups of animals called phyla, but here I'm just showing 3, right? So all of these things are animals, and they can be divided into the mollusks, for example, and the arthropods and the vertebrates are 3 major groups of mammals. Of animals, right? And so the mollusks and arthropods are different groups, and each of those have subgroups. Within the mollusks, you have the bivalves, like the things like oysters and scallops and clams, right? Or the gastropods, like snails. Or the cephalopods, like squids and octopus, right? And all of those are groups within groups. So an octopus is a cephalopod. An octopus is not a gastropod, right? An octopus is a cephalopod. An octopus is a mollusk. An octopus is an animal, right? Same thing here. Within the arthropods, you have insects, crustacean, arachnids. They all have things in common that make them arthropods. And all of these have things in common that make them animals, unique to the group that we call animals, that are different from plants, different from fungi, different from bacteria. Right? Okay, so within this group, vertebrates, right, you've got fish-like things and shark-like things that I won't get into, and then you've got things that live on land. And the things that live on land, since Linnaeus' time, even since back in this time, have been divided into the mammals, the reptiles, and the amphibians. Right? And so, did mammals actually evolve from this group? And if so, right, that's going to have to make us rethink what that word means. Right? Because these groups within groups, one of Darwin's main breakthroughs was understanding. We even called some of these groups within groups families, right? And Darwin said these are families because they are actual relationships that these things reflect, right? So we've got, for example, this is just using a few highlights here, right? You've got these groups that we call birds. Birds are within a group of things that live on land that have 4 limbs, right? All of these things have a vertebral column. And all of these things are within the group that we call animals, multicellular living animals, right? And so you have groups within groups within groups. And Darwin said those groups reflect relationship. Those groups reflect an evolutionary tree unfolding over time. Common ancestor, diverging and splitting and leading to different groups. And that's why we get groups within groups within groups. And it perfectly fits this sort of schematic, right? And of course, this is really busy, so we can simplify it, right? All of these things have similar animal characteristics because they inherit multicellularity and other characteristics from an ancient animal ancestor, right? All of these things have a vertebral column. All of these things have a vertebral column because they inherited a vertebral column and many other characteristics from this ancient lineage before that lineage started splitting into a bunch of different things, right? All of these things have 4 limbs, right, and live on land because these vertebrates would eventually evolve those characteristics here, and those inherited. All those things inherited those characteristics, right? These groups within groups within groups, and the characters that we had been assigning to those groups for over 100 years Darwin said this fits into an evolutionary paradigm. Right? And this was a huge breakthrough on understanding of our origins, of life's organization, of how things evolve over time, and this was one of Darwin's main breakthroughs. Right? And just to emphasize what an essential aspect of this, most of you, when you learn, let me go back there, most of you, when you learn about Darwin, right, if you did, right, I didn't learn much in high school myself, right, and it was like one day about natural selection and pepper moths, right, and that is important. Natural selection is a mechanism that helps explain how change occurs, but by far the most important insight that Darwin had, and the one that is the most robust and the one that is most universally accepted, right? Not everyone accepts natural selection as well, but how important it is compared to other things is a huge debate, right? But the thing that is most important about evolution, when you think evolution, you should think of the tree of life, not just natural selection. Natural selection is one mechanism of how things can change, right? The thing that is evolution, the one that has withstood hundreds of thousands of studies, right, millions of people hours doing research, right, is this idea of life being connected through ancestry, right? And this is Darwin's first playing around with this idea right after getting back from his voyage on the Beagle, right? Drawing a little stick figure of a branching tree, saying, I think, right? And then explaining here, I think that if these things are very different today, that there must be intermediaries between them in the past if this branching schematic is legitimate, right? So this is when he first started thinking about this. Look at when he first started thinking about this. It took him almost over 20 years to publish The Origin of Species before he started thinking about that. And this was the only figure in The Origin of Species. It's like 800 pages, right? And this is the only figure in The Origin of Species to emphasize how important and central an idea this is, right? This branching tree, right? And one of Darwin's big, huge statements that was very controversial at that time, right? Because we had hundreds, thousands of fossils in Darwin's day, right? And people were like, well, we don't see what you're saying. We don't see things that are intermediary between different things, right? And so your ideas seem to be wrong because that doesn't fit. And Darwin said, exactly. This is now a prediction. I think there's good reasons to think that we don't have nearly as many fossils as we think we do, and our fossil record is not incomplete, so that as we find more fossils, one of the biggest tests of my idea is that we should be able to see transitional forms, right? Things that show us how, for example, and he throws out this example out of many, but it was a big prediction of his ideas. For example, whales are now being understood in that time as being mammals and not fish because they have a bunch of mammal characteristics. But that doesn't make sense because mammals are all on land, right? They're mostly on land. So how did a whale come from a land or animal, right? From a land mammal? And Darwin said, as we find more and more fossils, I predict that we're going to find fossils that show us how the earliest whale ancestors were living on land and how they became slightly adapted to water, and then better adapted to water, and better adapted to water, and we're going to see fossils that show us how those changes occurred over millions of years, right? And then on top of that, when we have those fossils, then we're going to see, we don't expect that whales just became super well adapted to the water in one fell swoop. We're going to see that it was a little change, then another set of little changes, and then another set of little changes, and then another set of little changes. We're not only going to see that there's transitions, those transitions are going to tell us how something became better and better adapted over time to the ocean, right? And so that, of course, we could do another talk about the evolution of whales. We have dozens of fossils that show how whales evolved over time from hooved mammal ancestors. Whales belong in the artiodactyls, which are the even-toed ungulates, the even-toed mammals with hooves on them, right? And we have all sorts of fossils that show us how whales became better and better adapted to the ocean over time, right? And so we're going to do the same thing today, talking about, so where did mammals come from? And how did the things that we think of as mammals, right, how did they become that way over time? And what fossils can tell us about that, right? Before that, I want to so remember, what we're looking at here. This is the entire history of Earth right here. The earliest life, definitive life, is around 3.5 billion years old, but that's just bacteria. Right? For most of this time, it was all single cellular organisms, bacteria and protista, right? And animals don't really appear into the fossil record until this part of the time scale that we call the Phanerozoic, right? That means visible life because it becomes lots of multicellular life forms. And we can divide the Phanerozoic into the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, and the Cenozoic. The Phanerozoic begins 540 million years ago. And so now we're taking this and we're zooming in here, right? Because this is too small to really do much and put stuff on it. So we're zooming in here, and I told you we're going to start really our talk focusing around this time, but I want to give you kind of a little bit of a backdrop. What's happening in the Paleozoic? This is the Paleozoic, right? What's happening at this time? And this Paleozoic begins with a huge rapid burst of evolution of animal forms. All the major animal groups, not modern animals, but all the major groups of modern animals, right? Things like mollusks, things like vertebrates, things like echinoderms, right? All the major animal forms, the body plans, start to appear early on in the Paleozoic. Does anyone know what this is called? It's called the Cambrian explosion. Right? Some of you may have heard of this before. It's called the Cambrian explosion because the first part of the Paleozoic is the Cambrian. And so this is when, within about 30 to 40 million years, many animal groups are evolving in the water. Right? All mammals evolved originally in the water. Many, many, many different animal groups, from corals to jellyfish to vertebrates. And the vertebrates that first evolved were in the water. What do we call vertebrates that live in the water today? Loosely, fish. Right? For reasons I won't get into today, I'm always going to say fish with a quote-unquote because it's actually a very problematic word. Not very problematic, but it's a confusing word when you actually look at it. But we won't worry about that for now. You know what a fish is. They're the things that have a vertebral column like us, but they live in the water and they swim in the water. And for millions of years, hundreds of millions of years, right, from 540 million years to 370 million years ago, fish were in the water only. And then one group of fish called lobe-finned fish, today's modern lobe-finned fish include things like coelacanths and lungfish. I don't know if you've heard of those, right? But those type of fish would eventually evolve onto land. And that's a different story. We could do a whole, usually when I teach this class, I do 2 lectures on that story, right? How did a group of fish become better and better and gradually better adapted to land over time? And the groups of fish that came onto land and started living on land we call tetrapods. Tetra means what? 4. Pod means what? Foot. 4 feet, 4 legs, right? These are things that would evolve from fish that have eventually evolved from the fins of fish, evolved 4 legs that they used to walk around on land. Right? So that was about in the middle of the Paleozoic, around 380, 370 million years ago, right? And then another group from this group that's on land, the tetrapods, right? The things that are living on land, the vertebrates, the things with the vertebral column that are living on land, another group evolves called the amniotes. And now we're going to go look a little more closely at this group, right? So first, the backdrop. The things that evolve onto land we call tetrapods. They have 4 limbs with fingers and they live on land, right? Those are tetrapods. All the earliest tetrapods that evolved, we consider amphibious, right? We'll see this is kind of a hodgepodge word as well, right? When you think of an amphibian, what do you think of today? Yeah. Salamanders and frogs. There we go. Salamanders and frogs. You know those. Right? Salamanders and frogs. They are amphibious. What makes them amphibious? Why are they not something else? We'll talk about that, what this word amphibian really means in a second. Right? But there were a bunch of other things, right? Early on, the temnospondyls, the lepospondylus, the early transitional tetrapods, right? All tetrapods, all the things that came onto land were amphibious at first, right? Amphibious means tied to water, right? Amphibious means tied to water. Why were all early tetrapods amphibious? Because they evolved from fish, The earliest things were still tied to water. We'll talk a little bit more about what that means, right, in a second. But then, out of this evolution, as this group kept changing, one group eventually evolved after tens of millions of years, about 10, 15 million years, right, that we call amniotes. And if amphibians are able to live on land, at least sporadically, the amniotes are the group that we can consider the true land conquerors. This is a group that I want you to have in mind, right? And just think of them as that for now. Amniotes are, yeah, these things are living on land, but amniotes are the ones that would become way more dominant on land, right? Everything that you can think of that lives on land with a vertebral column that isn't an amphibian, frogs or salamanders, right, is an amniote. Right? Can someone name an amniote for me? You are an amniote. Thank you, yeah. Anything else?
Anything like a mammal.
Mammals are mammals. All mammals. Yeah, all mammals. Anything else? You are mammal. This is a mammal. What else is not an amphibian but lives on land? Reptiles, right? Lizards and reptiles. And then, of course, birds, right? Which, if you saw the last talk, birds evolved from within the reptiles, right? And within the dinosaurs.
Have you found any fossil representation of this?
Yes, this is actually Hylonomus, which is about, off the top of my head, I'm going to have to guess like 270 million years old or something like that. And it is an early amniote. Okay, so I'm going to simplify this real quick, right? You have this tetrapods, this group that evolved onto land. They're able to walk around on land, but the early ones were all amphibious, and they include the survivors that have still lived are the frogs and salamanders and cecilians. That for some of you may know about those. They're similar. They just are salamanders that have lost their legs, essentially. All right, and you've got this group called tetrapods. But you've also got this group called amniotes that eventually evolved out of that group that lived on land and become even better adapted to land. We'll see why in just a second. But first, I want to mention one thing about tetrapods that's going to come on later into the talk, right? We already mentioned tetrapods. This name means 4 limbs, right? And the earliest ones actually had 8 fingers, and then over time they lost a finger and had 7, and then over time they lost a finger and had 6, and then over time they lost a finger and had 5, right? And that's where it stopped, right? And some groups continued losing fingers, like horses only have 1, for example, right? And vestiges of 2 more, right? But tetrapods lost fingers, and 5 became like what tetrapods had, and all tetrapods that are alive today descended from the ones with 5, right? But in any case, 4 limbs with fingers, right? These are things that are walking around on land. Those limbs with fingers evolved from the fins of fish, right? We can see it very clearly. Certain types of fish that have the same structure of fins that we have limbs, with 1 bone, 2 bones, and many bones. 1 bone, 2 bones, and many bones. So again, different story, but just want to give you that idea. These evolved from fish, and we're going to talk about that more in a bit. But tetrapods also have something called stapes. Who can tell me what a stapes is? Anybody?
Well, there's something about here.
There you go. Something in your ears. A stapes is a bone in your middle ear. It connects your eardrum to the inner ear, the cochlea, where your brain is actually doing the interpretation of vibration, right? So it is a bone that connects the eardrum to the inner ear, right? And that bone functions to take whatever that happens to the eardrum, it amplifies it. Why? Why do things that live on land, why would they have evolved a stapes, this thing that amplifies vibrations? Any ideas?
Well, what of the food might be related to that?
Food, for sure. Food's always going to be important. But why? What's the difference between things that live on land and things that live on water in that regard?
Air vibrations are important.
Because air vibrations are a lot less strong than vibrations underwater, right? You can hear about whales being able to communicate over hundreds of miles, for example, right? Because the vibrations in denser water can travel more efficiently, right? So when things evolved onto land, eventually they evolved a bone, right, that helps amplify that signal of the vibrations. Because air is not as good at transmitting sound as water is, right? Where did this bone come from? Just pop, new bone? No, this is an important example of what we call a transfer of function, something we're going to talk about a couple times today. Transfer of function. Everyone touch your ear. All right? So you've got a bone in there called the stapes, right? What are you really close to? Open your, right? You are so close to the back of your jaw when you're touching your ear. It is very clear from a bunch of stuff I won't get into today because we haven't even introduced our real topic yet, right? That bone, the stapes, comes from what in sharks and fish is a bone that is part of the jaw apparatus. The very back of the jaw, that bone becomes the inner ear bone, right, over time. We're trying to understand exactly how. We're looking at some of the genetic clues of that, right, because it's not perfectly captured step by step in the fossil record. But some other cool things along these lines are perfectly captured in the fossil record, and we'll talk about that.
Is it trackable with vertebrate embryos?
Yes, so we're going to talk about those embryos, not necessarily for birds, because we're still going to be focused on mammals, but yes, we're going to look at some cool embryonic clues related to this in a minute. Okay, so tetrapods have a stapes. All tetrapods, right? Tetrapods include amphibians and everything else on land, right? Mammals, which as we see are in here, and reptiles and birds, they all have a stapes to amplify sound. And that evolved early within the ancestor of all tetrapods, right? And so this is important to keep in mind for later, right? Now we can finally go to the group that we were really interested in, right, which is the amniotes. The amniotes are true land conquerors for several reasons, but I'm choosing two, right? The two that I find most interesting, but most of us probably find most interesting. One of them is internal fertilization, and the other is the amniotic egg. When I say internal fertilization, what does that mean to anyone? Okay, there's a couple things you might be thinking of. You might be thinking like a mother that gives birth to a young that develops in the womb, right? But that's not what internal fertilization is. Internal fertilization is intercourse, right? Where sperm is delivered directly to the egg internally. This did not exist before, right? Why, right? So we have internal fertilization. You can thank your amniotic ancestors for this evolutionary development, right? We have internal fertilization. Why? What's the advantage? Well, what do amphibians do? Remember, amniotes are not amphibians. Amphibians are still tied to the water in a bunch of ways, which make them not as dominant on land.
They don't depend on water to transfer.
Exactly. Amniotes don't depend on water for sperm to egg transfer. Amphibians do, right? A frog will go into a pond, and the female frog will lay its eggs, right? And then the male frog will go into that pond and deposit sperm, often close to the eggs, right? But they're not having intercourse, right? Sperm in the water, eggs in the water, sperm swim to eggs, and they're fertilized in the water, right? This is what fish do. What do we call this in fish? Any fishermen, fisherwomen? Spawning, right? These fish are not having intercourse. The females are releasing eggs. The males are releasing sperm in a cloud together, and those sperm and eggs find each other in the presence of water. Amniotes become better adapted to land by divorcing this process from water being required. Right? That is internal fertilization. Amniotes also have, as their name highlights, an amniotic egg. An amniotic egg, right? Let's look here real quick. A frog, once the egg is fertilized in the water, if the water dries up, this is now a dead egg. No chance. Because not only does that egg need to develop in the water, when the frog is born, what do we call these things right here? Tadpoles. When the frog is born, it lives as a fish for several weeks, right? Before it eventually sprouts legs and can then walk around on land, right? What is an egg? An egg is a pond encased in a protective coat, right? It allows this organism to go through its tadpole stage, not in an actual pond, but within the protective fluids and membranes of an egg that prevents it from drying out. And we call it an amniotic egg because a lot of people think of, the yolk or the white of the egg. The white stuff is mostly protective proteins, just to provide stability and strength. The yolk is what? Nutrients, right? For the developing embryo. But the embryo develops within this amnion. And within that amnion, this is like ocean water, right? Or pond water, right? This embryo is still developing as a little tadpole, right? But it is in the egg. No pond needed. So this is a huge development. And these things go together, right? Oops, going back, right? Exactly. No aquatic environment needed for reproduction. No aquatic environment needed for early development anymore. And this would help make the amniotes very capable on land, right? So, do you have eggs? Right? You're a mammal. Are you an amniote?
Yeah, you see it on both early ultrasounds.
First, there are many mammals that still, not many, there's 5 species and 2 major groups, the platypus and the echidna, that still lay eggs. And as we'll see, all the earliest mammals were egg layers for tens of millions of years, right? Some of those are still alive. They have amniotic eggs, right? And our species, and species that give live birth, also have an amnion. What is the common name for, or the common process that's associated with the amnion for our species? We all know it. What is it? Water breaking, right? When the water breaks, that's the amniotic sac breaking, right? Basically, mammals have internalized this egg, right? Have internalized this egg, and they have retained that amniotic sac. It is a very similar protein. It is the same thing, the amniotic sac, right? So we are amniotes, right? So the amniotes divided into 2 major groups when they evolved. They would continue to diversify. One group would become the reptiles, and the other group would become the synapsids. How many of you have heard this word before? I'd be surprised if maybe 1 or 2 people. All right? Synapsids, not reptiles. Right? Mammals did not evolve from reptiles, but the early synapsids and the early reptiles were very similar. Right? Because when they first diverged, they were very similar things. Right? So it is fair to say that mammals evolved from reptile-like organisms, but they did not evolve from reptiles. These are reptiles. Reptiles evolved into things like lizards, turtles, crocs, pterosaurs, the big flying things that many people think are dinosaurs. Dinosaurs, and of course, birds that evolved from dinosaurs, as some of you have heard already. But we're going to focus on this group, the synapsids. Right? So how did mammals evolve? We're going to see that the earliest amniotes, right, they would diversify into 2 groups. One includes the synapsids. And so after the earliest amniotes evolve, right, the synapsids would burst in diversification. We see so many fossils of synapsids after amniotes evolve because they're a type of amniote, right? And this is a very successful group that is a true land conqueror along with the reptiles. Then there's a big mass extinction that I won't mention at all, otherwise we'll never finish this talk. Right? And then the synapsids rebound, right? They almost go extinct. Fortunately, they didn't. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here, right? But many go extinct, but then they rebound. And out of that rebound, eventually, the things that we call mammals evolved. Mammals are synapsids. You are a synapsid, right? So, quick question. I would do a poll with a little computer thing in my class for this, right? Which of these is more closely related to mammals than to reptiles? Look at this. I want everyone to raise their hand. Choose one. If you think you're embarrassed because you're going to get it wrong, don't worry. 90% of you are going to get it wrong. Right? So, which of these is more closely related to mammals, you and me, than it is to a reptile? And I'm just going to say A, B, C, D. Raise your hand when you think Right? So pick one in your head. More closely related to you and me than reptiles, right? To mammals. More closely related to mammals than reptiles, when we are mammals. So who says A? 3 or 4 people. Who says B? 2 or 3, 4 people. C? 6, 7, 8 people. D? Everyone knows this is a reptile, it looks like. Or E? Trick question. These are all more closely related to reptiles. Couple people say that, right? These are all more closely related to reptiles. Okay, so that's what we're going to do, is we're going to especially look at this tree, but just to answer this question, here's a croc, here's a pterosaur, it is a reptile. Here's a bird, it did evolve from the reptiles, right? Where is that sailback thing that many of you thought were dinosaurs belong? Right there, right? This is the Dimetrodon. It is an early synapsid. It is more closely related to you and me through this common ancestor than it is to reptiles. Now, it might be a little more similar to reptiles because when they first diverged, they had a lot of similar characteristics, right? But the things that it has in common with us show us a more recent ancestry, and that's what we care about for relationship. If that's confusing, don't worry about it. It takes my students 2 or 3 lectures to kind of figure that out and learn it. We won't dwell on it with too much time, but that's what we're going to do. We're going to zoom in on this and tell a couple quick stories. And I'm going to begin to move fast because there's only really one story that is complex here that I want to unpack, right? Synapsid evolution. And so we're zooming in on just this branch of the tree, right? And that's the beautiful thing about an evolutionary tree is it's kind of fractal in that way. I can just zoom in on different things and keep zooming in and keep zooming in because it's boxes within boxes within boxes, right? So now we're just looking at the synapsids, and we're question that we started at the beginning of, that this whole talk is about is how did mammals evolve, right? Well, we now know they evolved from the earliest amniotes, but the group synapsids, how did they evolve? The synapsids are all characterized by one temporal fenestra. Put your finger on your temporal fenestra if you know where that is. All right? Temporal fenestra, because when you put your finger on there again, chew. Right? You feel that muscle? That's called your temporalis muscle, temporal fenestra. And it's a hole. That muscle's going through a hole in your skull, right? And it helps move your low jaw joint. A single temporal fenestra is something that all synapsids have. You have it. Your dog has it. This isn't a dog. But you could pet the back of your dog as it's eating at the top of its head, and you can feel that big muscle that moves through that hole, and connects to the jaws. Right? Big, strong muscle for a dog. These are single temporal fenestra. This is a single temporal fenestra. It's a hole behind the eye. Right? A hole behind the eye socket. This is called an orbit. This is called the temporal fenestra. Right? All synapsids have a single temporal fenestra. There's a bunch of early groups, right? And here, like I said, this is where I really just start to say, look at all this, and we move on, because this is several million years, tens of millions of years of evolution of these groups with one temporal fenestra evolving into all sorts of things, right? This is a very diverse group, right? We generally call them pelycosaurs. You might have heard this word. This is a bunch of different pelycosaur groups. This is the most famous of all the pelycosaurs. A couple people used this word earlier. Dimetrodon, not a dinosaur, right? This is an early synapsid, right? With a single temporal fenestra. That's Dimetrodon, right? Same thing that you have, one single temporal fenestra. Dimetrodon has these sailbacks, right? We think this was for thermoregulation. This makes sense. This lineage would eventually evolve warm-bloodedness, right? I won't get into that story too much. Right? This is my favorite of the pelycosaurs because people loosely call this the keg pelycosaur. Right? It's got this incredible, crazy barrel-like rib cage. Right? That's it. There's so many things that we could talk about, things that are happening in this evolution. Every time there's a branching sequence, there's some novelty. There's some characters that we can put at every single branch that tell us how things changed over time, right? We're going to skip all of that and just say a bunch was happening for those tens of millions of years, right? And then we're going to get to this group called therapsids, right? Therapsids. And there's many things that make a therapsid therapsids, but I want to just focus on one, right? And that is erect posture. Erect posture. Erect posture is when the legs are directly held beneath the body, right? Legs directly beneath the body, like columns, right? Legs directly beneath the body, like columns.
Like a T-Rex.
Yeah, this would also convergently evolve within dinosaurs, erect posture, right? But that's a different story. Don't let that confuse you. This is something that would happen in two different lineages, but in here, it happens within therapsids. So, when I say erect posture, I don't mean bipedalism, right? This is not bipedal, right? I just mean that the limbs are directly beneath the body, not splayed out like this, right? I couldn't stand here for hours doing a presentation like this if I was like this, because I'm using a lot of muscle to stand up. If my limbs are directly beneath me, I use almost no muscle, right, to stand, because those legs are like columns underneath my body, right? That is erect posture. Story about posture is fascinating, right, and something that maybe we appreciate without even realizing. When we look at the first vertebrates were swimmers, were fish, right? And how do fish move? That's how they move, right? Undulations. Amphibians evolved from fish, right? Those first petropods were all amphibians. How do amphibians move? By undulation. Their muscles are so much more similar to a fish than your muscles, amphibians, right? Because they move in this way. This is not a great way to move on land. For an amphibian to get there, it needs to move this way, and then this way, and then this way, and then this way. Not very effective, right? We'll see, but they can at least move around on land with 4 limbs, right? So that's an advantage for being able to access new resources. But let's get into synapsids, and there you see, kind of, this moves along the lines of a fish, right? It's with limbs on land, and its muscles are much more similar to a fish in that way. But let's zoom in on synapsids, right? Because through synapsid evolution, we see that first, the earliest synapsids have sprawling posture, kind of like many lizards, and they run like this, right? So now they're not going this way and this way, but their limbs are out, like this, sprawling, and they move like this. And so this is a lot of energy still, right? It's better than doing this, but it's a lot of energy still because, like, imagine I need to do a push-up, right? Or something, or just hold myself up. How could I hold myself up longer? Like this, right? Or like this. Lots more energy in a sprawling posture. And we'll see that throughout its evolution, it's not like erect posture just comes out of nowhere. We see that over time, sprawling posture becomes semi-erect posture, eventually becomes, when we get to the therapsids, the group that we're talking about now, becomes erect posture. And that is a huge advantage, right? Water is a huge supporter, right? Absolutely. That liquid provides buoyancy, and so once you lose that support, this would evolve over 100 million years, this erect posture, right? And less energy is needed to support the body. Greater speed is enabled, and much larger size is enabled. If it weren't for erect posture, things could never have gotten this big. If an elephant had to stand like a lizard, it could never be that big. It could never support its weight, right? Limbs directly underneath the body allow this group, therapsids, to get way bigger. And this is an early therapsid that isn't a mammal, right? This is the largest mammal that ever lived, right? Paraceratherium. So, erect posture evolves within this group called therapsids. And therapsids is this incredibly diverse group that is changing and changing and changing, again, over tens of millions of years. And I'll just quickly say, these are all therapsids. These are all therapsids. These are the dicynodonts, 70-plus genera and maybe 200 species, representing thousands of fossils, right? And you've never heard of them. Dinocephalians, dozens of genera representing hundreds, if not thousands of fossils, and you've never heard of them, right? Gorgonopsians, dozens of fossils, dozens of species, thousands of fossils, right? All of which are showing us how these groups, therapsids, are changing over time, right? But we're going to just skip through all of that and just go through, those are a bunch of things. That group continued to change. What else do we highlight? And here we begin, well, I'll just say one thing about the cynodonts. The cynodonts had multicuspate teeth. Let's look at what that means. This is an early synapsid, the Dimetrodon that we saw earlier, right? Like living lizards that it shares ancestry with, right? It's got just simple conical teeth. Right? In the cynodonts is when we start to see multicusps on the teeth. And of course, multicusps on these teeth become what later on? Molars, right? Your molars, put your tongue over your molars. All those different bumps on your teeth are the evolution of how when these cusps became multiple cusps on teeth, right? Not with the canines, right? Your canines are still single cusped, but the premolars and molars would become multicusped, and those would evolve into molars. And so we start to see the beginning of that, right? With cynodonts have multicuspate teeth. And now, most of the things I've highlighted are things that are familiar to you. But now I'm going to highlight something that most of you have most likely never heard of, right? And that cynodonts have an expanded dentary bone in their lower jaw. And now this sounds like super trivial, but I want to tell, no, well, snakes do have a dentary, right? But not very closely connected to that. I want to tell you what this is, because this is a fascinating story, right? Cynodonts have an expanded dentary bone in the lower jaw. So first, the part of the story is not fascinating at all, right? This is the dentary bone. Early synapsids have a dentary bone and a bunch of other bones in their jaw. In cynodonts, the group that we're talking about now, that dentary bone becomes much larger and becomes the dominant bone in the jaw. We're not sure why. There's ideas on why that might be the case, but they're just hypotheses at this point. Just want you to know that. Expanded dentary bone, because it's going to be part of a bigger story, right? So cynodonts have these multicuspate teeth, and they have this expanded dentary bone, right? This bone in the lower jaw that becomes a bigger part of the lower jaw. Early cynodonts, just like I've said, and I'll even say this less, these are all different genera of cynodonts, each with several species in them on average. So we're talking about hundreds of different species of cynodonts that show us how they continue to evolve over time. Every branching point, there are characteristics that show us how this group evolved over time. The only mammals are here, right? These are still cynodonts that are not mammals yet, right? They're changing over time. And they would have more, and right, erect posture, this is something mammals have. Multicuspate teeth, this is something mammals have. An expanded dentary bone in the lower jaw, as we'll see, is something on the way to mammals, transitional to mammals, right? That's what we're highlighting here, right? These are some of my favorite cynodont fossils. These are actually one I took a picture of. These are in South Africa. This is a super cool computer CT scan of a fossil in the rock itself that wasn't even taken out of the rock, that we can now see kind of like into the rock without kind of going in there, right, for certain types of rocks. A lot of these fossils come from this incredible outcrop of rock in South Africa and other parts of Africa called the Karoo Basin that cover this period in exquisite detail. And I'll leave it at that. Okay, I want to emphasize, cynodonts have this expanded dentary. So what makes a mammal a mammal? We saw there's a bunch of cynodonts, and eventually mammals would evolve out of the cynodonts, right? Mammals have an exclusive dentary bone in the lower jaw. All mammals, whether it's a platypus or you, right, have an exclusive dentary bone in the lower jaw. What do I mean? Here's a, what is this? Not sure what this is. Some sort of a reptile, right? This is the dentary bone, and these are the other bones in the lower jaw. All early amniotes had this situation. Mammals have only one bone in the lower jaw. That dentary, it becomes expanded, and then it becomes the only bone, eventually, in mammals, right? So the early synapsids look like lizards in this regard. They had a dentary bone, but it was one of several bones in the early jaw. Then remember cynodonts? They expand the dentary bone. Then by the time we get to mammals, the only bone in the lower jaw is the dentary, right? So great transition. Not only a great transition, showing that in a different way, right? Or the earliest synapsids have many bones in the lower jaw. Dentary ends up expanding in cynodonts, right? And then in mammals, the dentary becomes the only bone. If mammals only have one bone in the lower jaw, what happened to these other bones?
See, it isn't an answer to that question. I'm referring to the sharp display that we have out here. With the, I've lost the name of it in my head. Where, can you explain where that came from?
The what?
The heliotrion.
Oh, the spiral jaw? No one is quite sure how that evolved, because we don't have great transitions on that.
Can you put it on your can you show us where it would be?
Oh, yeah, it wouldn't be on anything that we've seen here, because it's in the fish, right? It's in the early vertebrates that were in the water. Sharks are among the earliest vertebrates that ever evolved. Yeah, and Helicoprion is what, 300 million years old or so? Yeah, so it's way before this story. But yeah, great question.
I have another question. What
Yeah.
about like bone growth in the lower jaw? Like what some people get tori? Like it's like an extra bone in the lower jaw?
I don't know. I'm not familiar with that. Yeah. An extra bone or an extra strut of a bone?
It's like growth, like
Yeah.
in the palate.
Oh, upper or lower?
Lower.
Lower. I'm not familiar with that, and it could be a relic of some of the stuff we're talking about, or a growth of the dentary, right? An outgrowth of the dentary. Okay, so mammals have this lower jaw with a dentary, and the question is then, what happens to these bones, right? Touch the very back of your jaw again. What happens to those bones? They become part of the ear. Mammals also have not one stapes, they have 3 bones in their stapes, incus, and malleus, or what you might know as a stirrup, anvil, and hammer, right? The 3 parts of the mammalian ear. Remember that everything has a stapes that lives on land, right? But mammals have a stapes and an incus and a malleus. Those did not come from nowhere. Some of those bones came from the lost bones, the reduced bones of the back of the jaw, right? And we think there's several reasons for this. It might have increased amplification. It provides an uncoupling mechanism where these bones can disconnect and kind of save the eardrum. Bats do this a lot. When your ears ring after a loud concert, what's happening is that your muscles between your ear bones have disarticulated your ear bones, and which is why they kind of feel like this fog after you're listening to them. And with this 3-part bone structure, you get a higher signal transfer over a wider range of frequencies. So this basically, you can say, improves hearing in mammals, right? So in the early synapsids, there's dentary bone and other jaw bones. By the time we get to the mammals, right, the dentary bone is the only bone, and some of these lost bones become part of the ear. And not only the ear, middle ear bones, but also the tympanum, the bone around the eardrum. So we see, right, this story, and this is kind of like a story that you're hopefully kind of filling in the gaps for and saying, okay, those became smaller and smaller and smaller over time, and they became lost into the ear, or became incorporated into the ear. And that's not just something we have to assume, right? When it gets to the full nitty-gritty of seeing a step-by-step transition, there might be no better thing in the fossil record than this record, in a way that I will not get into it, because it's very detailed, right? When we actually look at cynodont evolution, we can see step by step how those bones become smaller and smaller, how new joints begin to develop so that there's 2 new joints, and then one of those joints is lost. We can see it in the bones, right? We can see it in the scar tissues that the muscles leave in, so that we can reconstruct how the muscles changed over time within these things, right? So that within just cynodonts, right, we can see such a detailed view of how these small jaw bones become smaller and smaller and then become incorporated into the middle ear. It is a fascinating story. And it is a beautiful example of transfer of function, something that we see time and time again in evolution. And as a solution to so many evolutionary riddles out there, where could this have come from? How did this just come out of nowhere? Usually it didn't come out of nowhere, right? Things get repurposed over tens of millions of years of small changes, right? And that is called transfer of function. And the really exquisite part of this story to really wrap up into this like incredible sort of depth of knowledge that we have, and also one more very fascinating thing to highlight. When it comes to evolution, I don't know if there's anything as fascinating as and not only fascinating, but now leading to huge breakthroughs in our understanding of how evolution works than this phrase. Has anyone heard this before? Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. Yeah, you've heard that? Let's break down what that means. Ontogeny is a fancy way to say the growth and development of an organism from conception to adulthood, right? From a single cell, right, the zygote, to adult, what are the changes that happen over the course of you started off as a single cell, right, in your mother's womb, right? And you became an adult over time. Those are a lot of changes that happened, right? That's called ontogeny. Ontogeny recapitulates, just a fancy word for replays, and phylogeny is a fancy word for evolution. Your growth replays aspects of your evolutionary history. Everything's growth replays aspects of its evolutionary history. So, for example, right, along these, going the wrong way, sorry, right? When you are an embryo, you have gill pouches. You have gill arches. Those gill arches, the front one becomes your lower jaw, right? And that's where we know lower jaws came from, a gill arch, right?
Do they still function as gills?
No, they don't really function as gills. They don't need to anymore because you have all your oxygen and all your nutrients come through the placenta, right? So they're not functioning gills anymore, but they still develop as gill pouches with gill arches, right? So you have a little tadpole phase, so to speak, right? Because we evolved from fish, right? Aspects of your evolution, of your development reflect your evolutionary history. So that gill arch, fascinatingly, that first gill arch starts off as a gill arch. It grows into the lower jaw, right? And then the back bones of that lower jaw start off as bones of the lower jaw. And then they separate from the back of the jaw in embryonic development and migrate into the ear and become the middle bones of the middle ear, right? The fossils tell the story. The developmental history tell the story, right? And they make this incredible, detailed understanding of how complex systems evolve over time, right? We have so much detailed knowledge into this that we can look at some of the specific genetic things that change to allow this to happen, right? What kind of mutations, what kind of developmental changes, right? And I won't get into all that super complex stuff, but a fascinating story, right? So mammals, right? The thing that makes mammals mammals, out of several other things, but maybe the biggest to understand, aren't some of the things that you were thinking about when you thought about mammals, right? The 3-bone middle ear, a platypus has that, you have that. Exclusive dentary, platypus has that, you have that, right? What about live birth? Not all mammals have live birth, right? But we do think hair, mammary glands for the production of milk, warm-bloodedness, we do think that these things evolved throughout this. Why have I not focused on these?
Because sometimes birds do have that.
That's convergent with birds, but that's not why I didn't focus on them. The things I've focused on are things that can be recorded within fossils easily, right? These things we can kind of infer, but are harder to kind of say, this is where that happened and this is exactly how that change occurred, right? Because what I've talked about are things that are preserved in bones, right? Warm-bloodedness is harder to preserve in bones, and it's also something that developed gradually, right? So it's like when something became fully warm-blooded versus mostly warm-blooded is hard to parse out, right? But there's debate on that, and we don't need to worry about that. But mammals have these things, right? And it's worth pointing out, right, when we go from the earliest amniotes to the earliest synapsids to the earliest therapsids to the earliest cynodonts, then the mass extinction, then the cynodonts emerge again and lead to the earliest mammals, this is the order in which we find those fossils, right? And this, again, this is separated by like 20 million years right here, right? From here to here is 20 million years, right? Yeah, even though it looks like a tiny gap, that's a huge amount of time, right? And so these things are showing us the sequence in which evolution occurred. The evolutionary tree perfectly fits the developmental sequence of fossils that we find, right? And all of this helps show this incredible story, one tiny part of the chapter of how you got to be here, right? Which is how all mammals got to be here, right? The earliest mammals look something like this. There's some earlier mammals that we know from scraps, but this is the earliest mammal that we know from relatively complete specimens and multiple specimens. This is Morganocodon from the Triassic. This is about the same time dinosaurs evolved, right? And of course, mammals would have continued to evolve. Today, they include three groups: the monotremes, which are the egg layers. Monotremes include what things that you know? I mentioned them already, yeah? Platypus and echidna, exactly, right? They still lay eggs, right? Because they evolved from amniotic egg layers. Then eventually marsupials would evolve and placentals would evolve. And these give live birth, right? Except marsupials, a lot of people think marsupials are for like little babies just to be carried in. But it's more than that, right? When a marsupial gives live birth out of vaginal canal, a little embryo comes out. A tiny little embryo this big. It is not a little baby. That little embryo crawls into the mom's pouch where it finds a nipple and it sticks its head onto that nipple and it doesn't let go for months. And that embryo develops in the pouch. It's not just to hold babies, it's to hold developing embryos, right? And that's how marsupials evolved live birth, and placentals evolved live birth by having that embryo internalized for a lot longer, right? And we won't get into all this. Just to emphasize, right, the earliest mammals all were egg layers. For like 100 million years, all mammals were egg layers until eventually live birth evolved and marsupials and placentals reflect that. Today, very few species are egg layers, just the platypus and echidna, which are divided into 3 and 2 species, each of those. And marsupials and placentals are the dominant mammals, and really the placentals are the most dominant mammals, right? And so we told this story today, right? Amniotes evolved, and we talked a little bit about how amniotes evolved. These are the true land conquerors, and synapsids are one of the branches of amniotes, and they are not reptiles. But the earliest synapsids were somewhat reptile-like. Those synapsids diversified. A mass extinction almost wiped them out, right? They were decimated. Fortunately, they didn't get wiped out, otherwise we wouldn't be here, right? They rebounded and would eventually evolve into the earliest mammals. And dinosaurs evolved slightly before that. So dinosaurs and mammals were living through this time together, right? Mammals did not evolve after dinosaurs went extinct, like a lot of people think. They were more on the fringes of the ecosystem. Dinosaurs had a bit of a head start, and that might be one of the reasons that they were dominant. But mammals would continue for 100 million plus years, continue to evolve. Throughout this entire time, they were laying eggs, right? And then eventually, the therians evolved, the ones that give live birth, right? And then another mass extinction occurred. The dominant dinosaurs of this time were wiped out, all of them except birds, right? And this gave these groups, especially placentals, it gave them a whole new world. They survived the mass extinction, and this is when placental mammals started to explode in diversity, right? Look at mammal evolution. Look at mammal numbers. This is kind of the thickness of these branches. Yes, there were mammals in the time of dinosaurs. This is the time of dinosaurs right here, right? But they were not nearly as diverse or abundant or speciose, right? Or dominant. And then after this mass extinction, random piece of space debris slams into Earth. All of the dinosaurs except birds go extinct. The mammals that survive would diversify spectacularly into the modern groups that you're more familiar with today, right? So if it weren't for a random chunk of space debris slamming into Earth, at this point, dinosaurs would almost certainly still be dominant because they had been dominant for 200 million years, right? fascinating story, parts of the fascinating story of how we got here. And I'll take whatever questions you have. Thanks for listening.
Here's a question for you about the topic.
Okay.
We're still in the start. Are they genetically trackable? Can you genetically divide DNA track the function of the bone as it transfers its function from the actual the baby? Now, whether it be a mammal, let's say it's a dog, or let's say it's another critter or a human.
Yep.
Can you track that little thing, that little ear bone functioning?
Yep.
Can you track it genetically?
Absolutely. And that's what I was kind of showing here. I go back here. That is kind of the cutting edge of trying to understand this stuff. Is you can look at the development of one of these things and see what genes are turning on and off at different times to see, okay, this is what happens for that developing bone in the jaw, for it to break apart from the jaw. This thing is happening genetically as the embryo is developing, and you can track those things, and you can.
They have little things that you can turn off and on genetically.
Yes, and that's a huge. So the turning on and off of things genetically is a huge part of what governs evolution. If you've heard of the concept of evo-devo, or evolutionary developmental biology, this is the cutting edge of biology, of how we understand how change has occurred. It's not just an A turns into a T, right, which is what you might have learned if you learned one thing, right? It's entire networks of switches of genes turning on and off that are governing evolutionary changes, as well as genetic mutations and gene duplications and things along those lines. So yeah.
Click all these things off, or you can click.
Super complex interreacting networks that are turning different genes on and off at different times, or making genes do a lot or making them do a little. So yes, it gets really complicated to try to piece that together, but that is kind of the cutting edge of what we're trying to understand. Yes?
So through the Mesozoic, are we talking about like what size generally? Is there a misconception that all of them are small?
No, there were probably no bigger than medium dog-sized mammals during the entire Mesozoic.
Okay.
They were somewhat ecologically diverse. There were gliding mammals, just like there are today, not the same ones. There were, they were like Wolverine-like mammals that ate small dinosaurs, but they were not huge. Yeah, that did not happen until after the huge dinosaurs. Right? There were also small dinosaurs, but until after the huge dinosaurs went extinct, then those ecosystem spaces become open for mammals.
Come out of hiding now since they're gone.
Right. That's a good way to think about it.
Circle still an hour. I think I see a few kids getting pretty restless. So let's give Dr. Dan a good show of appreciation. And those of you that need to move on can go ahead and do that.
Thanks again for coming. Hope you enjoyed. Yeah.